So, welcome to today's video. This is Susan Fuller from Grief Heals. And today I wanted to talk to you about the main criteria that I use, and you can use, to assess whether your grief is normal or not. Now, before we get into too much of this, I do want to say that depending on who you talk to, 80 to 90% of all grief is within the normal range. So you probably don't have much to worry about. I know it doesn't feel that way. I know when you're in the middle of it, it feels like it's always going to feel this bad. It's always going to be this crazy, and it's never going to get any better than it is right now. I tend to think more on the 90% and maybe even 95% of all grief is quite normal. So the criteria is it moving? Is it moving? Is it moving and changing? And is it moving in the direction of healing? Because we do heal from death, from a death. We do heal from that. Our grief is the process of healing that takes us from the death back into life. It's slow, it's arduous, it's painful, and it's long. It's long. This is not a fast process. But it is moving. It is moving. But it's hard for people to see it in themselves because they're feeling like, oh, this is as good as it's ever going to get. Even if they can see they've improved from the first few months, or they look back and say, yeah, I'm better now, but it's not going to be any better again. This is as good as it's going to get. And then it always gets better. It really does. And it's very subtle. It's so subtle. And the metaphor I like the best to really describe what this looks like and what it feels like is the difference between a live theater production and a movie. A live theater production, although it's the same script, same costume, same blocking, same everything except for the audience, it's always subtly different. The energy's different. It's just subtle, little differences. And that's what your grief is like. That's what normal grief is like. It's subtle, and when people tell their stories, what usually happens is people will tell their story about the death and their grief and the illness or accident, whatever it was. And as time goes on, and for me as a witness of sorts to this process, what happens is that pieces of the story, new pieces get added and other pieces drop off. And it's in the telling of the story that you're processing this death. And so it is changing little bit by little bit. So that's the live performance. Contrast that with a film, a movie. You watch that movie, you can watch it 100 times, 1,000 times. It's not going to change. Maybe the old ones, the film would fade, but that's it. That's it. The film is the same again and again and again. And I have seen people get into that state while they're grieving. Not a whole lot of times, to be perfectly honest, but it's very recognizable when you see it. And where it's the same story over and over and over again, it's the same details. It's very rote. It's like rehearsed, and the affect's the same, the presentation's the same, the emphasis is the same. Nothing changes in how they're telling their story. Nothing. That's of concern to me. That's grief that's not moving. The rest of it is all over the map. Does that make sense? And some people will sometimes ask me if they feel like they're going backwards. I said, that's okay. Backwards is movement. It is. And I think of it as going back and picking up a stitch when you're knitting. You know, you lose a stitch and you got to go back and pick it up. It's kind of like that sometimes people go backwards for a bit in their grief because they missed something that needed to happen earlier on. And that's fine. And then you go pick up the stitch and then you begin moving forward again. So it's very hard for people to see this in themselves. It's incredibly difficult to see it yourself. So there are a few ways that you can get that feedback. One is, my number one go-to has always been go to a grief support group. As long as it's well facilitated, it's one of the best places you can be. And what happens in a group is that you come in and say you're in the first 6 months of grief, 3 months. You come in and you see people at 9 months and a year who are doing better than you are. You can see they're not in the same place you are anymore. And they see you coming in very early grief and realize they're not there anymore. And that's a very organic process. It's not something we talk about a lot in my groups, but it's there. It's happening because it's really pretty unmistakable. So that's one way. For people who don't like groups, and there are a whole slew of them, counseling, coaching, therapy. Again, if you have somebody who really understands grief, and a lot of therapists don't, but as long as it's somebody who understands grief and can mirror back to you your progress, that will work too. You know, I remember one client who she was about 9 months. I followed her for the whole first year, and at about 9 months, we're having a conversation. All of a sudden, she said something about the future. She used the future tense. And then she went right back to her story, the story she'd been telling with varying details. And I went, whoop, 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 whoop. You know what you just said? And she looked at me completely blank. She says, no, what did I say? I said, you just talked about the future. I did? She says to me, yeah, you did. And there was that little piece that said something was shifting. At 9 months, still very much in grief, and was for some time after that, but that she was beginning to think about the future. And that was a very, very different thing from those first 9 months. So that's where counseling, coaching, therapy can be very helpful to just mirror back to you your progress. Now, the other way that happens, which is, it's hard to orchestrate. This one's hard to orchestrate. I think it happens to a lot of people, and others it doesn't happen so clearly, which is why I would go for the coaching group, those experiences, to ensure that you do get that. I used to work for hospice, and I would call people and I'd follow them through the year. And this gentleman I talked to way in the beginning, I'd left him some messages early on, but he really didn't need me much. He really didn't. But I called him around the first anniversary, and he says to me, he says, whoa, all of a sudden I just flashed back to where I was right after my dad died. And it wasn't until this moment that I realized how far I'd come. He associated me with his dad's death, and that was the impact. That he realized that he was doing okay, and he was doing so much better, and he hadn't realized it until that moment. I had an experience when my mother died, and a couple of weeks before she died, this was back in the days, cassette tapes. I threw in a tape and I recorded a conversation with her because I wanted her voice. And she died, And I couldn't listen to it then. And I didn't think about it really much. I don't think I thought about it at all, to be perfectly honest, for most of that first year. And around the first anniversary, I had such a longing to hear her voice. And I pulled out the tape, I put it in, I turned it on, and I turned it off again. I couldn't listen to it. And the reason I couldn't listen to it was because on that tape was her sick voice. She had cancer. She was declining when we had this conversation. That was her sick voice. And what I was remembering and longing to hear was the voice I had known my whole life. And it was in that moment I realized how far I had come from the day she died to the first anniversary. Was I done? No. But I'd come a long way. And it wasn't until that moment that I had that experience that I could say, oh, I've really come a long way. I'm remembering the mother I knew my whole life, not the one who was sick and dying for a year or so, 10 months, something like that. It's really interesting. So you may have those sorts of experiences, and those are very helpful. They're markers. They're markers that you are healing. Yeah? So be aware of your grief moving. Family might not see the changes, and they're in it too, but a close friend might. Certainly a coach will, counselor, groups, all of those things. And you might have one of these fortuitous experiences that really highlight how your grief is moving and changing, because it really does. And ultimately we heal, which just means becoming whole. That's what healing really means. So we're headed toward a new wholeness. It's different from where we came from, but we are moving in the direction of real healing. So on that, I will leave you with that for today. Wish you well. You take care. Bye-bye.